consultation with Seattle Nanny, and then we hired the first one that we met. So that wasn't my intent by any means, but we were just really impressed with her. I think I did meet with one after her just because I was like, let's make Seattle Nanny do their job.
For sure.
But yeah, and then Isabel was interviewing other places and we didn't want to let her go. So it wasn't a long process for us.
For every kid that didn't have a chance, and every kid that was out of options, Seattle Children's is fighting for you. Because this isn't about beating the odds. It's about changing them for all kidkind.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Elaine Sulkin, and I am the publisher and CEO of Parent Map. We are really thrilled to have put together what we consider to be a consortium of the very best parenting media in the country, and that includes Chicago Parent, Metro Parent, New York Family, and Staten Island Parent to bring you Parent Ed Talks, our series. So thank you for joining us today. Today's talk, Stronger Together, a new model for the modern marriage with Nate and Kaley Klemp. On behalf of our magnificent parenting media partners across the country, it's really our collective passion in business to help build an inclusive, safe, educated, and loving community for our families. We are laser focused on educating and better serving families. And I would say, like you as parents, we don't settle for the status quo. Before we kick off learning with Nate and Kaley today, please take a minute and go to the chat on your Zoom and let us know what city you're joining from. It's fabulous for us to see. Oh, I love it. Monroe, Washington, Buckley, Washington, Seattle, New York, Kenmore, New York City, phenomenal. Rochester, Maple Valley, Staten Island. We love it. Anyway, we're thrilled to have you join us. And Nate and Kaley are back talking at Parent Map, which is wonderful. They are co-authors of the 80/80 Marriage, a new model for a happier, stronger marriage, and returning speakers. So welcome back, you guys. Good to see you.
Hi, nice to see you.
So good to be here again.
So just to kick off our conversation with you, I think we have to just start with you describing what an 80/80 marriage looks like. We're all so used to, trying to get to 51-49 or something like that. So talk to us about that first, and welcome.
Thank you. Well, it's so good to be here, first of all. We thought we'd answer this question in two parts. So Kaley's going to talk a little bit about the 80/80 side, but before we get there, we wanted to talk about the precursor to 80/80, which is a model that I think everybody is very familiar with, which is 50/50. And we think of this as the default model or the default mode that most modern relationships fall into. And I think there's a reason for this. We are the first generation in really all of human history trying to achieve this thing called equal marriage, trying to be equals and in love. And when we try to do that, mostly by accident in our relationships, the default model or the most obvious model is to say, well, how about we do this? Let's make everything perfectly 50/50 fair. And I'm going to keep a mental scorecard of all of my amazing contributions and juxtapose them against what Kaley is doing or more likely is not doing. And then once we achieve this perfect point of 50/50 fairness, something amazing is going to happen. We're going to ascend into the heavens of marital bliss and everything's going to be awesome forever. We tried this for about a decade. We interviewed about 100 people when we wrote our book. And what we found is in almost every case, this method ended up resulting in the opposite of what we actually wanted. So it turns out the more you keep score, the more you strive toward 50/50, the more you find yourself in these cycles of resentment and conflict.
So instead of 50/50, what we advocate for is 80/80. And the idea there is, of course, the math is totally ridiculous. There is no such thing as 160%. We are aware of that. And yet, if you strive to contribute 80%, recognizing that you're never going to make it, it takes away all the scorekeeping. It takes away all of that tit for tat. What did you do? And how many chores does it equal? The time that you drove the kid to soccer practice? The other piece that we think is so important is that when you can shift your mindset, so the mindset of 80/80, which we also call radical generosity, then gives you the foundation where you can build more structure. And I imagine that we'll talk about that because structure is such an important part of parenting to know, do we have shared values? Do we have aligned priorities? Which really is a fancy way for saying, like, do we know what we're saying yes to? What are our boundaries? Do we know what we're saying no to? What about our roles? Are those on purpose? Are those by design? Or did those just show up by accident? So the initial preview to 80/80 is try to overshoot the mean. And when you're in that mindset of radical generosity, it's a foundation to build some structure.
So let's unpack some of the language that you're
Yeah.
Yeah, lots
because,
there.
you know,
That
you're
was like a no messing around
you're
sentence.
almost in heaven if you can reach radical generosity. So really, like there's one question here in particular that I love. It's kind of a long one, and I kind of want to read it, but it's going to relate back to the mindset shift and structure to get to radical generosity, and these guys are not there. Okay.
Okay.
Let's do it. Let's do the whole
So-
question.
Whole question. We're ready.
Here it comes. Sometimes it feels like my husband wants a pat on the back and intimacy every time he does the dishes or a different household chore. Meanwhile, I've never received a thank you because I did the dishes and honestly don't expect it because it's something that needs to be done regardless of who does it. He sees it as give and take. I see things as necessary tasks that have to get done to upkeep a household, not because I need validation from my partner, because I did them. Is there a way to motivate him to help get things done around the house without offering sex in return? I've asked him straightforward and he hasn't come up with anything. So I'm curious if you have any suggestions on how to navigate that conversation and get him to understand that not everything equates to what's in it for me.
You're right. That's a long and good question.
Lots in there. You want to
Lots in
start?
there.
I have some ideas.
Why don't
but-
you go first? I'll chime in.
Okay. Well, yeah, what I hear in that question, a couple things. One is it's a question about scorekeeping and tit for tat.
Mhm.
And I hear that there's a kind of a ledger of sorts that's happening that's, basically looking at various acts of service, and then those are paid off through intimacy. And that sounds like it's not working for one of the partners. But if I go one level deeper underneath that, there's something really interesting in that question about appreciation, because the husband there seems to be asking for appreciation. The woman asking the question seems to be saying like, hey, do we really need appreciation? I mean, this is just like the stuff we have to do. So I would pause right there on that and say there's a real opportunity for a pretty profound shift if both partners can really lean into appreciation. We think of appreciation as being maybe the most powerful single hack that you can use in your relationship, because it changes the way in which we see our relationship and the way we see our partner. If we see our partner through the glasses of everything they're doing wrong, we will find every single thing that they are doing wrong. And that will generate within us resentment and all sorts of anger and irritation. If, on the other hand, we shift to the glasses of appreciation, we start to now notice what they're doing right. And by offering a specific appreciation, all of a sudden, it's like you're motivating your partner to be in this game with you. Whereas criticism does the opposite. Criticism is basically saying to your partner, hey, like nothing you do is ever enough. You might as well just stop trying. So I see a real opportunity there to start to develop a habit of appreciation. And that habit had this kind of upward spiral effect where it really does motivate both partners to be more engaged, to be more radically generous.
Yeah.
But you probably saw something different.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is what I saw that. I also saw different roles in their relationship. So for her, it sounded like, I mean, dishes are just things that need to be done. And for him, it was like, woo, this is an above and beyond thing. And I wonder if we flipped the script, if there are some things that perhaps he's doing that feel like, well, they just need to be done, that for her feel like an above and beyond thing. And so then I'm sort of back to what Nate was saying. Can we appreciate things that feel above and beyond, even if in our own world, they don't feel that way? In part because I think, I mean, what bad thing happens from appreciation?
So, for a lot of people, this is radical acceptance, behavior modification,
Mhm.
and, you can't just suddenly, a lot of this is just bad habits.
Right.
So tell us a little bit, maybe you as a couple or people that you work with, like, because it sounds great, but you are so habituated into, how much I do, what you don't do. How, like, give us little goalposts.
Yeah. I think the place to start here is to notice how much we do by accident. And that most couples haven't even paused to look at what are we doing and is there any intentionality here at all? And we learned this through so many of our interviews where couples would talk about who was doing what. And we would ask them how they decided to do it that way. And they would kind of stare at each other and make weird faces. And then they go, well, it just sort of happened that way. And there are these great stories in the book. We talk about a gentleman who we were asking about this. And he was like, I don't know how I got to be the toothbrush guy, but if I'm not home, teeth do not get brushed. And so, step number one, I think you're saying something really important, Elaine, which is notice what you're doing by accident. Bring that first and foremost, just even into your consciousness. What are these habits? Because you can't change something until you know what it is. Then once you know what it is and you say like, oh, we're accidentally keeping score about X and Y, or like somehow I'm always the one who gets up in the middle of the night when there needs to be water, or somehow you're always the one who, whatever the chore is, you're always the one who takes out the trash. In our house, Nate is, I'm sorry for all of the Buddhists on the call, Nate is the spider killer. So like anytime there's a spider, it has not occurred to me to be like, I wonder if I could access a shoe and handle this for myself. No, I like yell, I'm like, Nate, there's a spider. They're like, how did that come to be the roles? Like mostly because of my fear, but do we even know what they are? What would you add?
Well, just to make this a little bit less abstract, our story is really a story of starting totally by accident. So yes, we wrote this book on the 80-80 marriage, but we did not start there. We started in a marriage about 18 years ago, we got married. So 18 years ago, we got married. We were 26 at the time. And we really did not think intentionally at all about the roles we took on, about the values we had, about the priorities we had. And the result was we fell into this pattern of Kaley being the over contributor.
I did everything.
Me being the consummate under contributor.
Oh, and I resented him.
And this is a pattern that is very common. It's often gendered, but not always. It can go the other way. But it's a really difficult pattern to find yourself in. And what we found is that for us and many other couples, once you have kids, the cracks and the fissures in that kind of pattern start to become immediately obvious and inescapable. So anything that was there before you had kids is now amplified. It's like turning up the volume on a stereo system. There's no way not to hear it anymore. And that's where, to Kaley's point, I think there's an opportunity here to say, wow, what if we were to take a step back, look at all the things happening in our life by accident and get way more intentional and think about how would we actually design this to work if we were thinking about this from a more intentional perspective. And my hope is that that's the opportunity for us today, is to think about not only your marriage, but your parenting, your family as a whole. How do you want to design that so that it works best for everyone?
And I love what you're saying, that if you start with where you really are, then you can make a better design.
So let me ask you, is it possible to preconceive something before kids, or as you're entering that space, or do you have to actually wait, which I think 99% of the population does, that when you're in the, I did this, you did that, throes of the nasty, to like, is there anything you can think of that you could actually set yourselves up for better success before you get to that?
I think you're speaking to the ideal. And yes, in the ideal, you could set it up in advance. One of the greatest compliments that we were paid was from a person who gave the 80/80 marriage book to each of his adult children and said, as soon as you're about to have a meaningful relationship, read this book. Because I think there is something around, it's easier to start a good habit than it is to undo a bad habit. And so if you can start on a solid foundation, then when you add the chaos of kids, which kids are hard. Like, we don't want to pretend that there's and then there was the silver bullet and kids were easy. Kids are hard, but it gives you at least a head start in that journey.
I think that's a genius wedding gift idea. No, that's great. So talking about kids, there are many questions about conflicts in front of kids, conflicts that are sourced through the kids and not exposing them to parental discord. And it's so incredibly hard in the moment not to, is to self-regulate, I'll say. Talk to us a little bit about how to navigate the day-to-day
Yeah.
of that.
Well, first of all, I want to touch on a point you made that I think is really important. There's the day-to-day content of our lives, the decisions we're making about logistics or where we're sending our kids to school, or whether our kid is going to be playing the stand-up bass or the violin.
It's a hugely contentious
That was the one
discussion.
we just went through for the last 3 months in our household. And it's easy to get caught at that level of content and think that really all of this is about these specific issues. And if we could just solve each of these specific issues, we would somehow be better as parents. We would be more in sync as a family and that sort of thing. I think a better way to look at this is to think about what's one step beyond just the content itself. And I would call that the master skill of communication between the two of you. So really, the ultimate parenting move in some ways isn't necessarily a philosophy, at least from our perspective, or a particular parenting modality. It's your ability as parents and as a couple to have those really intentional conversations and really hone the skill of communication between you. So obviously that means a couple things. One is the skill of just staying current on what's really going on with your partner. We like to call this revealing. And the basic idea is that so many couples get caught in the trap of what we call talking about the weather, which is where you have a conversation like this.
Oh, it's windy today.
Yeah, it really is windy.
Gosh, do you think that
Yeah.
spring is coming, or do you think it's going to
I
stay
don't
winter
know.
for
I
a
think,
while?
well, it's going to snow. I think on Thursday, it's going to start snowing.
Wow, we might need to update our Costco list.
Yeah, I think we do. Nothing wrong with that conversation, right? But there's nothing that's actually being revealed or communicated in that conversation other than the wind and going to Costco. So revealing looks like going one level deeper and starting to talk about, wow, here's what I'm excited about. Here's what I'm a little bit afraid of. Here are some of the struggles I might be happening or having at work or whatever. So there's that piece, but then there's also the piece around when things go haywire and when there's a miscommunication or there's some sort of tension or there's a disagreement, do you have the skill together as a couple and as parents to navigate that and to reveal what's really going on without triggering a huge conflict or a huge fight in that moment?
Yeah. And as I think about sort of this question of how do I actually do that in the moment? To your point, sometimes it's tricky. Sometimes the deep breath will work. Sometimes the like, hey, I need a timeout for myself will work. And I think really building on what you're saying, Nate, around this idea of revealing, it changes the conversation so much in that moment to be able to say, like, ooh, that one hits close to home. Or to say, I feel really nervous about, I mean, this is such a silly example. I feel so nervous that if our daughter changes instruments midstream, she's going to lose all of her friends that she's made. That's totally different than like, you're just trying to control her and make her like you. Right. So this revealing, even though it sounds kind of abstract, it does really help in those heated moments.
Well, I mean, another thing that I actually love about using the revealing language is, we have said for decades, we're our child's first and most important teacher.
Yeah.
And the way you're modeling communication, to show your fears or vulnerabilities or happiness is great modeling.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was
Modeling.
actually thinking it could be kind of fun and helpful to have a conversation in both ways,
Sure.
the habitual way and in a more revealing way.
Okay.
So maybe we take the issue of our daughter doing bass versus the violin.
Or is there an example, a question? I'm
Yeah.
happy to do
Is there
any of
is
them.
there some
topic?
a live issue we could use
I
here?
think
and
that's
just
a
play with
good
it?
one because
Okay.
I think you've got it.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it would be amazing. I'm a jazz piano player. I love jazz. I see Jory, our daughter, being this amazing jazz bassist and like, oh my God, the fun that we will have together. We're going to do like duets, have our own little duo. I just get really psyched about her taking bass lessons.
And am I doing it the good way or the bad
Bad
way
way.
first? Okay. This is just you controlling her. I mean, this is so like you, just to make her do what you want.
I'm not controlling her.
You're
I mean,
totally controlling her.
no,
You're
I
not
think she
setting up
just
the
has a
lessons.
way better
You're
chance of
not
success. How
listening
many
to me.
kids play the violin?
All of me.
Every kid plays the violin.
Which is
She
why
can
she'll have
actually
friends because
succeed if
she's
she plays the
doing
bass.
something that so she's going to go play by herself in
This
the
is what's
corner.
best for her, not what's best for me.
So selfish.
And see. Okay, so that's one way to have the conversation. Another way to have the conversation might be, hey, I notice I just feel nervous about our daughter continuing to do the violin. It feels like she doesn't want to become a professional musician here. She's really into Taylor Swift, and playing bass would just give her a way of playing the music she actually likes and listens to.
Yeah.
And it'd be fun to like play some jazz.
Yeah. I mean, what I hear is that you want to connect with her and you want to make sure that she's doing something that she'll actually keep doing. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, totally. And if I'm honest, like there is a part of me that loves the idea of her playing the bass.
Yeah.
And
It's interesting because I hear you feeling afraid that she's gonna she's gonna do the same thing as everybody else and not be unique. But I feel afraid she's gonna lose all her friends. Like she's been in this orchestra for 3 years. I'm worried she's gonna be lonely.
yeah, no, I hear that.
Good job.
That maybe wasn't the best issue, but you
No,
can
but-
kind of get a feel for,
The way you're communicating and validating one another's, I mean, I think, that we're not educated in this space.
Yeah.
Unless you came from those parents.
yeah. And I
What-
think to just like unpack some of what
What
was
we
happening
do.
there in the first scenario, it's all happening very fast. So you'll notice that the speed intensifies.
And we're talking over each other.
We're talking over each other. And there's also this blame thing that's going on. There's this subtle finger pointing. You're making this all about you, or you're doing this, you're doing that. There's a lot of the you are doing, you are doing, you are doing. And when we shift to that model of revealing, we call it reveal and request. What we're trying to do is totally move beyond the world of blame. And one way to do that is to lead with what's going on with me rather than pointing the finger at Kaley. Wow, we just did the thumbs
Oh,
up
we
thing on
got it.
Zoom. There we go. So, but rather than me making this about Kaley and what she did wrong, I'm going to try to make it about me. Like, wow, I
Yeah.
noticed that I feel nervous. I notice I feel scared. I notice I feel some anger coming up. It's basically leading with what we would call your inarguable truth, something that's just happening for you that really isn't, there's no argument to be had about what's going on inside of me.
Yeah.
Leading with that, and it results in a much healthier conversation after that.
We also really love this tool if you find yourselves on opposite sides of an issue. I think she should play the stand-up bass. I think she should play the violin. I think we should be more disciplined. I think we need a curfew. I think we don't. I think we should be more lax. Anytime you find yourselves on opposite sides of an issue, this is a really great tool to see if you can find what's your partner saying that makes sense. You might not agree with every single point they're making, but is there something in there that they're saying that makes sense? Oh, I hear you saying that she's not going to be unique. That makes sense to me. I value uniqueness. We both do. Like then you have something you can start to build toward.
Outstanding. So I love this question that starts with an answer.
All right. We don't even have to answer then.
Don't say date night.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
So there are a slew of questions around connecting with young children and the impossibility of that, you know, and a lot of people don't have, the resources, they work different
Totally.
shifts.
Yeah.
So, I think, but
So you should do a date night. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, how about this? Can I set the context and then I think you can
Sure.
offer ideas?
Yeah.
So the context here is that challenge is so real.
Mm-hmm.
At UCLA, they did a study where they followed around couples with kids and they were measuring the amount of time that these couples spent together every single week.
Notice the unit.
And the average couple with kids spends 35 minutes a week together.
That's nuts.
5 minutes a day of time together. So that is our starting point. And I think that's just some useful data that tells us like, okay, if we're starting at 5 minutes a day, where do we go from there?
Right. So one of the things that we agree with is that date night doesn't work for everybody, but date something you can often find. So true confessions, Nate and I occasionally do date night, but we are much more reliable on date hike. And we're at the point now where our daughter is 12. And so we can get up on a Saturday morning while she's sleeping in and her preteen delight, and we can hike just the two of us for an hour. And that gives us really connected, meaningful conversation. And it doesn't feel like now we need a babysitter and now we need whatever. So there can be these stolen moments that occur. If you have younger kids, clearly you're not leaving, a 4-year-old by themselves. That makes sense. Then it's about finding, if we're only starting with 5 minutes a day, where's a stolen moment where you can actually give your partner your full attention. That one of the things that we really noticed both in the research and in the interviews that we did is that we're reliably giving our most important relationship partial attention. And that looks a little bit like you're talking to me and I'm like, oh, I'm totally listening to you right now while I'm scrolling and swiping. And as we're doing that to each other, of course, we're not revealing what's really going on. And so this can be anything from kick your devices out of your bedroom and have 5 minutes of an actual conversation with each other before you go to sleep. Our ritual is we do appreciations before bed, and sometimes that becomes a conversation. Just so we're trying to catch each other doing something good throughout the day, and that leads to a conversation. These are rarely are they like many hour conversations. Often they're 5-10 minutes, but then I go to sleep feeling so much more connected.
Yeah, and this is where I think just the general theme there is adding a little bit of structure
Mm-hmm.
can be super helpful. The other tool we talk about a lot is a daily check-in for couples, where literally it can take 5 minutes. So maybe appreciation is that. We also have one we love that can be a couples check-in or a whole family check-in called Poopsicle, Popsicle, Dreamsicle.
It's the same as Rosebud Thorn.
So it's basically
kids will
your
play
bad
if
thing,
you add bathroom
your
language.
good thing that day, the thing you're looking forward to. But for couples to have some sort of a ritual like this, again, it doesn't take much time, but if you build it into your day as a habit, then I know what Kaley's struggling with. I know what she's excited about. And I also know, what she's looking forward to. So things like that, they're time efficient. They just require a little bit of structure, a little bit of work and discipline at the beginning to turn them into habits, but then they become automatic.
You raised, the all evil smartphones.
Yeah.
And there's a slew of questions about connectivity, resentment,
Yeah, totally.
actual presence. And again, you hit on that a little bit just now, but could you talk a little bit more in the most practical sense of, because this is you guys now have, teens. You have been
Mhm.
together for a long time. You've gone through this entire journey and you've seen the horrendous shift, from like, when my kids were really, really little, there was like stranger danger and, it started the
Right.
stranger danger. You can't walk to the park on your own and that. And then you infuse in 2010, the beginning of the smartphone and what we're facing as parents with kids, isolation and the level of uncivil discourse. And so talk a little bit about that as parents, as role models, and then, some of the challenges that we're all confronting. And here's where parents are not necessarily their kids' best teachers.
So I want to pitch Nate, because he will not pitch himself, that he just solo authored a new book. It's called Open, Living with an Expansive Mind in a Distracted World. And he picks up exactly your two questions. Question one is, how do we stay open to ourselves in this world of digital distraction, all of our devices? And question two is, how do we stay open to each other as we're encountering all of this polarization, political polarization, belief polarization? So for a very deep dive, I highly recommend Open. And for the abbreviated version, I will ask the author for his opinion.
Well, yeah, there's so much here. Let's just start with a little bit of context. The average person spends 11 hours a day on screens. They have asked these interesting would you rather questions to people, such as, would you rather spend an entire month without your smartphone or your spouse? 44% of us choose our phone over our spouse. Would you rather spend an entire month without sex or your smartphone? 56% of us choose our phone over sex. So I just want to start the conversation there to be like, this is real. 50% of teenagers describe themselves as having a significant addiction to their phone.
And that's as a teenager. I mean, this is nuts.
So the thing that's happening here is there's two levels of this issue. One level is starting to look at our own addiction to screens as adults, because as you say, we're the ones who are modeling this behavior to our kids. There's no way we can ask our kids to not be on smartphones if we can't do it ourselves. So I think that's the first tool, is to really get clear on our own addiction. And then with our kids, to play a significant role in guiding them through this mysterious new universe that I call Screenland. A couple tools that we found really useful that I just want to mention. One is this thing called the K Safe. We have one in our kitchen, K Safe. You can get one on Amazon. It's like $50. It's basically this Tupperware with a lock on top where you set a timer. You can put all your phones and tablets in there, and you cannot get into this thing until the timer's up. So what we've been doing lately is when we have family time, we have our daughter put her Apple Watch in, we put our phones in, we put the iPad in, and we set a timer for 2 hours and nobody can touch their phones. And it feels terrifying at first, but it's quickly followed by a feeling of liberation. The two seem to go hand in hand.
Mhm.
So that'd be one thing. The second is to come up with a family screen contract. So we have done this, and we have found that it needs to be amended and revised, that you start with certain hypotheses about what should work, but then it's like, well, actually that didn't work. We need to change this. We need to modify this. And I would say the final thing is Jonathan Haidt just came out with a book on this where he talks about the great rewiring.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
The anxious, and I think one of the main lessons we can get from him is that modern parents are way too smothering when it comes to what their kids do in the outer world, like walking by themselves to the park,
Right.
going
That's a
outside to
stranger
play.
danger, yeah.
So we're way too strict with we're way too strict with that, but we're way too lenient when it comes to what we allow our kids to do in the digital world. And we need to kind of flip that on its head, bring a little bit more structure and supervision to the digital world, and maybe open up a little bit with how we let them play in the external world.
Well, first of all, congratulations on your book. We put it in
Thank
the
you. I
chat,
appreciate that.
and I can't wait to get a copy. Really, it's so, I mean, it's kind of overwhelming. I mean, I'm on an insane mission with Parent Map right now and setting up our lecture series for next year, kind of based on this topic, because
Yeah.
whether, I mean, I'm curious how you feel about, dare I say, smartphones in schools.
Mm.
Yeah.
I mean, we're really lucky from the perspective that our daughter's school has a policy where no smartphones and no smartwatches are allowed at school. So they leave them. Part of that is based on the research that's describing that kids are learning significantly less because they're doing continual partial attention in the classroom.
I would love a copy of that policy.
Yeah, okay.
One, this maybe goes back to the early mention of, appreciation, but there's a few questions how to approach your partner so that you don't feel, you always feel like you're doing everything, so that you're asking and not nagging. And, I mean, it goes back to your
Mhm.
kind of relearning how to communicate with each other. But,
Yeah.
in the day to day, it's exhausting. So a little
Yeah.
more on that.
There's, I think, two levels to the question that you're asking around what happens when it feels like we're doing more or it's sort of overwhelming. There's a foundational piece that we did in our relationship, which is way back when I was sort of doing everything and Nate was under contributing. That's our generous name for it. We sat down because I was going to break. And we wrote down on sheets of paper what each of us was doing. And then when we looked at the sheets of paper, Nate was like, oh, wow, I see why you're so exhausted. I see why you're so overwhelmed. I see why you're resentful, that it was not even close. Now we want to be really mindful here. This is not about like, and you're striving for a perfectly even list. That won't happen, right? That's where you have to have the mindset of radical generosity first. But what we could do is when we looked at our list, then we could have a conversation about what things do you like to do? What things do you not mind doing? What things are awful for you? What things Do we have the resources to outsource? What things can we ask for help with? Where can we do trades? And that way there was at least a foundational structure so that on the day to day, I'll give you some silly examples. Nate doesn't mind grocery shopping. And so he does.
Love it.
He actually
actually
does.
fun.
And
Yeah.
so
You're my husband.
Yeah.
he loves
Totally.
it. And so it doesn't feel like a chore for Nate to go grocery shopping. Whereas I am happy to do it, but it feels like a chore. In the same way, I actually get like strange satisfaction from doing laundry. Like there's this moment where like it goes from dirty to clean and I feel happy about it. And so it's
And
not,
I always screw it up.
you do.
100% of the time, I put
It's like-
something in the dryer that's not supposed to go in there.
He shrinks things, he
Yes.
dyes things pink.
That's
I
what I
mean,
do.
it's really this, it's like
Yeah.
a hidden skill. And so for us, it would be so silly to try to make it perfectly even. Well, Kaley, this is your week to shop. Well, Nate, this is your day to do laundry. We're just happy to divide based on what we're good at. And so I think there's also a sense of, if you know foundationally, it's relatively balanced. You know what you're good at, what you mind. And then it is back to the communication and appreciation, just the revealing. This is another silly example. We made this meal a couple days ago. And then we ruined our pan. It was just this wild, like burned mess. So like me and the bone of me and I'm like the steel wool. By the time I finished, I turned to Nate and I was like, I could really use some appreciation for cleaning that pan. And he was able to give that to me. It's such a silly example, but it made a difference because otherwise I was like, I'm next time that pan goes in the trash.
Okay, I'm going to go from the steel wool to the tough subject of intimacy and sex.
Oh wow.
Hey,
How
all
do we go from
right.
steel wool to sex.
How's
I
that
like
for
the
a segue?
transition.
I feel like there's a
it.
connection there somewhere.
And I'm on the other side of this. I am so blessed to have, little grandchildren.
Mhm.
And, I'm here to say those, I feel like I have the greatest husband in the world. And I was ready to split it many times because of our 3 little kids. He was traveling as a lawyer, and it's the exhaustion and really having no training, no mentoring, and no real skills to help communicate and navigate that. So, being on the other end of it, it gets a lot easier when your kids are older. That's for sure.
Mm.
But I think intimacy throughout relationships is tough for many. And I think the stats that you were putting from your new book and the inquiries that you were asking about, your devotion to your spouse or your cell phone
Yes.
are alarming, but realistic. So talk to us a little bit about how to keep that alive and going and
Yeah,
different. It changes.
Mhm.
totally. Well, first thing to say about sex is we think there's this trap that many of us can fall into of viewing sex problems as somehow isolated to this one tiny dimension of your life.
Right.
So if you're having problems in the bedroom or tension around sex, must be something going on with sex. This is the worldview of Cosmopolitan magazine. If you've ever read Cosmo, it's like, spice up your sex life with these 5 new positions or these new toys or whatever, this or that. Not that those are bad. That can be super
Fun.
interesting.
But not the root.
But we take a slightly different view, which is that your sex is a reflection of the rest of your life and the rest of your marriage. So another way of putting that is what goes down in the line at Costco is often what goes down in the bedroom as well. So if you have resentments and uncleared issues that are showing up in the logistics of life, it's probably going to show up in the bedroom as well. And so that's really just an argument for thinking about this whole thing as a unified system, that we're really trying to cultivate connection in all parts of the system. And that's going to ladder up ultimately to sex. But then I think there are also some sex specific problems that show up. So one of the main ones is called sexual desire discrepancy, SDD. There's actually a technical term for this. 80% of couples experience this. It's basically a fancy way of saying one person wants it more than the other person. And there usually is in most couples a higher drive partner and a lower drive partner. And that can be a really big issue for a lot of couples. And because it's sex, it's harder to talk about it. It feels kind of taboo. It feels kind of awkward to talk about. And so that issue alone can just fester. So, how do you then begin solving some of these things? Well, with an issue like drive discrepancy, one of the best things to do is to really just start having conversations around it or even adding structure. So, one of our most controversial ideas is this idea of scheduling sex. And a lot of people are like, no, it should be organic. It should be spontaneous. It should be just like it was when we were 17. But the reality is, your life is not like it was when you were 17. You don't have the freedom. There is no time. And so adding some structure like that can actually help both partners relax, the low drive and the high drive partner, because it's like we're not constantly just wondering, like, is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? You
The
probably
other
have
piece-
other tools.
Well, the other piece that I would add is there are ways to take advantage of the hybrid workplace. So there are many complications, which we will not talk about in terms of like who's going to the office, who's working from home, remote work, always on, et cetera, et cetera. But if your kids are headed to daycare or to school, there is time in the middle of the day where, again, you have to schedule it. But if you treat it like the most important meeting, that can be a pretty exciting meeting. We also think that there can be lead up that's really interesting, where if you're on your device, what happens if you send your partner a suggestive text? Now, again, be wise about which devices you use and where that stream shows up. But just even signaling to your partner helps keep it so that it isn't like, oh man, it's Friday. Well, check the box.
I love it. There are a few questions about, entering the older parenting years and, how to navigate your teens. And I mean, you guys kind of gave an example of a not so serious disagreement that you were having.
Yeah.
But, there are such contentious issues around teens, curfews, driving, and it's very unsettling. And so, can you go to something a little bit more intense? Because these become not about your child's success, but your child's well-being and safety.
Yes. Yes. I think that you're pointing to something really important. When we get into, you can do this with younger children as well. I think it becomes even more important and clear as they age. The place to start as a couple is around shared values. What are the things that are the few orienting principles that you share as a couple? And you might say safety is number one. And then you might say, we want to raise a child, and these are made up, that is caring. Or you might say, we want to raise a child who is independent. Or you might say, we want to raise a resilient child, or we want to raise a connected child. If you go to the place of values, you are much more likely to find a place to start where you can be more aligned. Because to your point, I have yet to find a parent who's like, I'd like to make sure that my child experiences being alone, scared, and unsafe. That sounds great. No, of course not. But underneath the arguments around, should we let them have a phone? Should we let them be on social media? Should we let them go to that party? Should we intervene if we know that parents aren't going to be there? What's our stance about driving? How many hours with a permit? Like all those questions, they are rooted in a value. And they're often rooted in our own life experience. So if I grew up in a place where my car was my freedom, And to imagine my child not being able to be free is something that's like, I can't even fathom it. In contrast, if my partner grew up in a place where they walked and rode their bike, who needed a car? It doesn't represent anything to them. That value of freedom feels abstract to them around a car. But if we can come back to like, oh, of course I want my child to feel an experience of autonomy. How can we construct that together? Helps us stay on the same page.
I mean, I really appreciate the focus on values because that, first of all, has to be worked out. You make a lot of assumptions when you're a young couple. You don't even think about, some of these things. And I love the comment. I mean, I shouldn't say I love it because it almost caused her a divorce. Comment in the chat. This woman said, my husband allowed my 12-year-old son to download Snapchat and it nearly caused a divorce.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I understand that.
getting to a place where you have, a place for that. On the theme of values, there are a few questions about the reality of today and the lack of a society that's based on religion and community and those, kind of values that are greater than yourself. Not about academic success or, financial success. So, talk a little bit about that as a family, maybe, how, it takes the pressure off the omnipresent academic success for kids and how you see that in 2024, really,
Yeah.
because it's a problem.
Yeah. Well, part of what I think that question is pointing to is this macro level trend where we used to have all of these stable institutions, and there's all sorts of interesting literature in the field of sociology about this, that if you go back 40 or 50 years, you had bowling leagues and civic associations, and people were members of the Kiwanis Club, and you had church and religious
Synagogues
institutions
right.
playing a really big role in everyone's life. And as a result, the family was almost like less important to the formation of children and parenting. You could almost get away with more because you had this backdrop of institutional trust. And as we all know, these institutions, for a variety of reasons, are fading into the background. And so I think maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, I'm not sure. But for us as parents, it's another reason to get really clear about our role and to shift from that accidental model to something more intentional. So, for example, with values, one of the things we did early on is we both identified our values, but then we also, and this is very us, we wrote them on this like chalkboard in our kitchen so that every day when we go to the cell phone charger, actually, it's right next to it, we see this physical manifestation of our values. And we're really trying to create habits of appreciation and check-ins and things like that with our daughter. Actually meditate with our daughter every night before we go to bed. We're trying to create all of these rituals so that at least in our house and in our family, there is this structure. There is this almost like institution of support, because we're not really seeing that in the outer world right now. So in some ways, it's almost a reason to do more of that within the family.
Agree. I think that you point to something really valuable also, values and valuable, that academic success can be wonderful, but the deeper question is in service of what? Is that in service of purpose? Is that in service of contribution? What is that in service of? Allows you as a couple to guide and really help your kids understand their priorities. Probably taking us too much down a rabbit hole, because one of the conflicts that we see between a lot of couples is around what is the role of school and academic success in our family. How much do we prioritize that? How much do we sacrifice for it? How much do we push our child? Do we make this sort of a value indicator for them? So there's a lot around that can create very tricky conversations within couples.
I'm going to take a pause for, we're going to just post a little poll to see where our attendees are coming from. So I'm just letting everyone know that'll pop up on the screen and you can respond to that. But I think, going back to, you're your child's most important teachers, and the issues that we're talking about with, isolation and, the greatest fear, I would say, that parents have in this day and age, especially if you have tweens and teens, is suicide.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And, when we're all so busy and distracted, talk a little to parents' fears about that and the ways you see families able to counteract some of the horrors that you see and the fear that you have. So I'm not saying it very well because it's such a tough subject, but
Yeah.
the family, you're a parent and that's your greatest joy and is your children, and it's a huge fear for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where I would go here is, first of all, returning to this idea of your primary practice as a parent in all of this is to cultivate your ability to have these really hard conversations with your partner more skillfully.
Mhm.
That's the master skill when it comes to almost everything we've been talking about in terms of parenting: smartphones, risk, suicide. Like, if you're able to have these really edgy and uncomfortable conversations with your partner, you're able to really know each other and stay connected. And so these really gnarly life moments don't throw you off. They actually become opportunities for connection, which is a powerful transformation. When it comes to the issue of teen mental illness and suicide itself, I mean, this is where I do think we have to play a really active role as parents, because I don't think the research is totally clear at this point, but we certainly know that there are some contributing factors here, one of which is amount of time on screens. Probably the bigger one, at least for girls, is the amount of time spent on social media. So I'm a really big fan of Wait Till Eighth. It's a movement saying, hey,
Love
let's
it.
wait till eighth.
Mhm.
I actually think 16 is an approach. So Wait Till Eighth is about when your kid gets their first smartphone. Our daughter's not in eighth grade. We've given her an Apple Watch, which basically allows her to text. Even with that, we're having issues. But the idea of Wait Till Eighth is, hey, let's wait till eighth grade to give our kid a phone. And it's a collective action problem, because if all parents are giving their kids phones, then we're the bad parents. So can we try to do this collectively as parents together? Let's all wait until something like eighth grade. And then I think 16 or so is about the right time for social media. And I know that sounds crazy, with kids now lying about their age to get on Instagram and Snapchat at 11 and 12 years old, but really leaning into that conversation with your partner, I think, is maybe the best thing you can do, so that you're ahead of all the downstream consequences of some of these decisions.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't think there's a more important issue out there today. It's why,
Totally.
you mentioned Jonathan's book, your book. It's grabbing people by storm, and the wait until
Yes.
eighth movement. And what I want to say to the audience is, because I am on a mission with this in the state of Washington. I hope that the parenting publications that we partner with and the consortium of, there's many, like 120 publications will join in it. Nate and Kaley are going to share their school's policy. We selected a superhero recently who's a legislator who put forth a bill to ban schools, cell phones in schools. So, I think it's one of the things that we all can feel powerful in protecting our kids. You wouldn't put a baby in the car without a car seat. You wouldn't get in the car and not put your seatbelt on. And we are in such need of like figuring out that regulation, and it'll help marriage, it'll help family dynamics, everything that we can possibly think of. So, and then I want to leave you guys to have a closing statement, as they say, and thank you tremendously for everyone's asking. Yes, you will get a recording. Everyone wants to show it to their partner. So go ahead and give us a closing statement, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We're thrilled to have people share this conversation with their partners. I think it was up on one of the early slides. Every week we write a newsletter and we tackle different questions that people offer to us. So if you have a question, send it in. It's possible that there will be a newsletter. You can sign up for it. It's free. It comes out weekly. It's at 8080 Marriage, so 8080marriage.com. Easy place to stay connected with us, learn about what we're thinking about. What else should we say, Nate?
Well, I would just say thank you to everyone for taking the time to be here. I know you've got a lot to do. Obviously, you're busy parents, but this is an investment that will pay off for you, because having these intentional conversations with your partner is probably the most important thing you can do as parents.
I want to say one last thing, because I'm probably the oldest person on the Zoom. And I cannot get over how hard it is. I'm in a good enough marriage, 40 plus years, how hard it is to break into one of those conversations. Really, like it's just, and I'm like an out there person. And so my recommendation is sharing something where someone else's voice is there, like yours, or go to therapy, but because sometimes it's really hard for you personally
Yeah.
to
Yes.
say something.
Yes. One of the things that I love about the book, The 8080 Marriage, is the second half is all exercises. And so it's an on-ramp for these conversations. It's a gateway to start something where it's like, gosh, cold start is really tricky, but having something where you can say, hey, I heard this thing, or hey, I read this thing, at least gives you a way to get started.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Hope
you,
to see you
everyone.
again soon. Thank you.